So Professor Rachel Payne, who's a Professor of Human Geography and also in the School of Geography, this time in the section of Geography. And Rachel, over to you if you want to introduce yourself and say anything other, and also to hear from you about domestic abuse in and as times of crisis. Thank you very much, Rachel.
Okay, thank you very much. Just sharing my screen here. Has that worked? Can you see the slides? I'll take that as a yes.
Yes, we can see the slides, yes.
Thank you. So hi everybody, and thanks a lot to Liz and also to Alex for organising, and thanks for Diane's provocation, Sue's yesterday, and actually all the papers yesterday, which I thought were really great. I guess just a quick sideways comment first of all, that we've talked a lot about the negative aspects of the pandemic for women, but I also think it's important to recognise that for some there are quite positive experiences and associations with lockdown. And I'm thinking here of my work with survivors over many years where post-abuse, I mean, not that that's always possible, but post-abuse surviving is all about being at home, and that often becomes really fundamental to the work of rebuilding. And then also for some, that thing of not having to present in public. If you experience harassment, bullying routinely, or gender tyranny, it can be quite a relief. So I'm thinking here of a group of trans women that I'm working with in my current research. There's just one example of that. So I've worked over the years with a number of feminist domestic abuse services, so organisations that explicitly base their practice on feminist principles and are now rapidly changing the services that they offer. And trying, I guess, to keep attempting that idea of radical care that Sarah talked about yesterday, although obviously, you know, tied up with regulations from the state in this case. And then also practicing resistance to largely male policymakers and politicians' decisions that come cascading down, perhaps especially in times of crisis. And today I want to think about that relationship of domestic abuse to crisis, and partly drawing on evidence from other sorts of what are commonly seen also as crises. So first of all, domestic abuse is a pandemic itself, which is a language that started being used by activists. It's often not cast as a crisis, so the naming and scaling of crises always reflects particular ideologies. And when I say scaling, I mean things are constructed as though they're either problems of private or of public, intimate or global, whereas in reality, all of these crises occur simultaneously at different scales. Just some of them are made kind of spectacular and become more prominent. But we know that domestic abuse is clearly of pandemic proportions. In November 2018, the United Nations Secretary General described violence against women as a global pandemic. And it's certainly not decreasing. Instead, we're seeing new and renewed forms of gender-based violence in different parts of the world, emerging as societies and economies continue to change, obviously with massive consequences for health, social and economic well-being. In terms of domestic abuse during a pandemic, it's been described, you can see there just in the recent month or two, as the shadow pandemic, a perfect storm for controlling violent behaviour behind closed doors, and a hidden pandemic. So globally, we've seen surging numbers of emergency calls to helplines with rises of anything between 25 and 300%, increases in internet searches for support by those affected, and higher numbers of domestic homicides as well. In the UK, sort of almost within a couple of weeks at the start of the lockdown, we were seeing higher death rates and far more people needing help. But it's all fine, because Priti Patel said on the 28th of March that anybody experiencing domestic abuse is still able to leave and seek refuge. Unfortunately, of course, that's not as easy as it sounds, because leaving when you're under surveillance 24/7 is really hard, and that sense of being watched all the time is really part of the dynamics of abuse. And also, what refuge after 10 years of austerity, which is another interrelated crisis. So of course there's been some money put in recently to increase refuge places, but it's nowhere near enough. So how to understand this relationship of domestic abuse to crisis? Well, this relationship of domestic abuse to COVID is not a surprise, because there's lots and lots of research over many years now showing that war, disasters, humanitarian emergencies, climate change and so on are always related to spikes in domestic abuse. So if we take war and armed conflict, for example, domestic abuse has risen in every major conflict since the First World War. In fact, we're something that the ancient Greeks reflected on, with gender-based violence used as a tool against enemy populations. Of course, we know about sexual assault in the military, and also within conflict-affected families when veterans return home. And I've written a bit about this and speculated there's really no chicken or egg here, that it's rather a sort of contemporaneous development through history of two very, very closely related, in fact, phenomena. In disaster studies, we see gender-based violence also following disasters and humanitarian emergencies. I'm doing some work at the moment with Nahid Rezwan at Dhaka University in Bangladesh on the relationships between cyclones and domestic abuse, and also a smaller project on the flooding in the UK. So these are all interwoven crises, and they're devastating because they all involve an attack on that sense of home or heartland and identity, as well as those material dispossessions. Really helpful, of course, is to draw on feminist work and also Black and post-colonial analyses, which have kind of had these critiques of this notion of crises as these sort of separate spikes of spectacular occurrence for many decades. And here the lessons are, first of all, that intimate violence and public crises are fundamentally connected. Not that one sort of leads to the other, but they're actually both part of the same thing. There are systemic inequalities in who's most affected, and Diane's just talked about that. And then thirdly, that people's lived reality of all these crises is not of short-lived intense peaks that come to public attention at certain times. So, oops, where am I? So in conceptualizing crises, it's important to think about those temporalities as well as the spatialities. And this kind of long winding over time being used as an excuse for less public scrutiny of certain types of crisis. What Rob Nixon called in 2011 slow violence, a concept which has sparked a range of other commentators to explore, for example, slow disasters, slow crises, slow emergencies. But it's also worth pointing out that feminists and Black writers have interpreted violence and crisis like that for decades. So rather than the big things or the little things, the argument is that they're all part of the same thing, and scale is a kind of fallacy that's used to make some events invisible and downgrade them. Finally then, just a word on gender responses to crises, and again, sort of picking up on some of the stuff that Diana's just talked about. We know that responses to crisis are gendered, from Sylvia Wolby's work, for example, on the financial crisis, used as a tool of governance. And crisis can be mobilised in relation to gender in different ways. They are very conservative deployments, and then there are progressive namings as well that give us a little more hope. A word of caution, though, from my colleagues Julia Heslop and Emma Ormerod, who wrote a paper on the housing crisis recently. They're both at Newcastle. It's a great paper, really critical paper, thinking about the ways in which UK housing policy has used the concept of crisis to deliberately channel it through specific narratives which create and legitimise subsequent policy actions. But more hopefully, and perhaps resonant with the Black Lives Matters protests going on at the moment, COVID makes clear that the world can be changed for a crisis. We've seen that. We've seen more funding for refuge spaces being provided at the drop of a hat. And women's organisations are calling for COVID to be used as an opportunity, Sylvia Wolby's tipping point, if you like, if we treat domestic abuse itself as a pandemic. I'll stop there.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Rachel, and thank you so much for keeping to time. Everyone's keeping to time today, which is amazing. That was really interesting to me because, and also fascinating starting off and actually seeing, you know, some things in terms of domestic abuse during pandemic is not all bad, which for me it's just been, I've been, you know, terrified since I work with schools and communities and families, and it's just thinking of kind of families locked down in situations that are really not what they want, and not being able to get the help. But actually, you know, you saying, well, actually, when people have been able to get the help, to be together or not having to go out and be public, you know, and actually, so I'm also quite interested in some of these things we're quite concerned about. What actually in those crises and difficult times are the affordances being provided at the moment as well? Which is another kind of hidden discourse of this moment. So I'm just wanting to see whether there's any specific questions that have come up for you, and can people please write their questions? So we have maybe something about these crises as a tool of the state, a way of absolving responsibility. Is there anything that in there for you in terms of domestic abuse?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, perhaps not so much. So perhaps what Michael's talking about there is the reason why domestic abuse is not really thought about as a crisis in the same way as some of these other larger, more spectacular events. I mean, there's writing sort of going way back, but also always come back to Sylvia Wolby's 2015 book, where, you know, there are problems going on for sort of decades and decades, but at certain points it suits the state for them to become construed as crisis, and to be seen to be dealt with. And these are some of the issues that Julia Heslop and Emma Ormerod are talking about in the paper on the housing crisis. You know, it's like, right, it's a crisis, we've done that, we've dealt with that. And actually, you know, clearly those crises are still going on. So yeah, I would agree with Michael's point there about absolving responsibility. Yeah, the thing about domestic abuse is it's not even on that kind of agenda.
Yes, and then there's a point about sort of future Brexit discourse, whether I'm not quite sure exactly what, Claire, future policy decisions relating to your last point.
Yeah, I'm not sure if, Claire, you mean the crisis of Brexit, or if that's in relation to domestic abuse. So maybe Claire will follow up with another comment. In the meantime, Liz, I mean, there's some interesting, in relation to your point, there's some interesting research coming out about the mental health effects of the crisis. And obviously, you know, for many people, it compounds mental health issues. But there are some groups of people for whom it's actually a relief. You know, it actually helps with certain forms of anxiety.
Absolutely, yeah.
And especially for those people for whom threat and risk are outside the home rather than inside the home.
Yes, and a whole load of things, you know, since things are not normal, being not normal is actually okay at the moment, isn't it? So, you know, so there's lots of not normals that can be kind of claimed at the moment. Yeah, I suppose I was also very interested in your comment to do with seeing domestic abuse as a pandemic, and that's obviously, you know, now the government was suddenly able to respond to this, and suddenly able, once it had finally decided it was going to respond, which took a long time and more time than it should have. Yes, it could make certain things, it could suddenly make certain amounts of money available. It could increase universal credit amounts. It could, not that an awful lot of people have got their universal credit, but you know, a lot of measures that had been impossible by a government such as this were suddenly possible. So I'm kind of wondering what, you know, is there does this offer any affordances for things such as domestic abuse to be taken more seriously? Because actually if we can show that the effect on people of something like domestic abuse, you know, the actually cataclysmic effect on so many people, and the other kind of economic costs of those effects on the wider society, does it offer affordances for this and other things to be seen as pandemics, or is that really not what we should be doing?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think what's happened is it's sort of been thrown into focus, hasn't it? Domestic abuse, and you know, it's another way of getting people to think about domestic abuse and what it's like living in a kind of permanent lockdown for survivors who are the most severely affected. My worry is that once COVID's over, if it's over, the problem goes away.
I mean, I think that's the worry about all of this, isn't it? That, yeah. I mean, I've been worried, you know, right the minute it started was well, okay, they're making all these things available, but as soon as there's a way of seeing it any kind of way over, then the economics will kick back in, and it's, oh, we have to do this for business, otherwise we can't survive, never mind everything else. So all equalities go by the board. But I'm hoping that things will have reached so many tipping points, such as we have seen with Black Lives Matter, that those tipping points can't be rescinded. But we'll have to see. But we have to move on.